He woke before dawn to the sound of engines, looked out his window, and saw bulldozers tearing down the barn his father built with his bare hands. By sunset, everything he loved was rubble. But the next morning, when black SUVs lined his driveway and federal agents stepped out, no one in town could believe what they came to say. They called it progress. He called it theft. At 68 years old, William Bill Hargrave had seen plenty of so-called progress roll across the Kansas plains, flattening everything in its path: barns, family homes, memories. But he never thought he'd live long enough to watch it swallow up his own land, the same acreage his father had tilled after returning from Korea. He'd known something was coming the moment the men in tailored suits started showing up at the edge of his property, pointing at survey flags and murmuring to each other behind expensive sunglasses. They were from Redwood Horizon Developments, a company that claimed they were going to revitalize the area by building luxury housing and a golf course. Bill didn't care much for golf, or the sort of folks who thought they needed a gated community to keep out the people who'd been here long before the roads were paved. He'd built that barn himself 35 years back, after a tornado flattened the first one. Every nail, every beam had a story, some of them sad, some hopeful. He'd raised cattle there, stored hay through brutal winters, and kept a battered old American flag tacked to the rafters, a reminder that some things were worth standing up for. When Redwood Horizon sent the letter with the so-called final offer, Bill folded it neatly and set it on the kitchen table. He knew he could have used the money. God knew the arthritis in his hands made the chores harder every season. But he also knew no amount of cash could buy back what they were asking him to surrender. The offer expired. He didn't sign, he didn't call. He just went back to tending his cattle and repairing the fences the wind kept knocking down. So, when he heard the engine rumbles before dawn, his first thought was that some neighbor's tractor had broken loose and come down the old gravel lane. But when he stepped onto his porch in the gray light, he saw 2 yellow bulldozers idling in the drive, their diesel fumes coiling into the cold March air. A man climbed out of a white pickup behind them. He wore a black windbreaker and the same smug expression Bill had seen in courtrooms back when he still wore his army dress uniform. "Mr. Hargrave," the man called, "I'm afraid you're in violation of the development easement. We're here to clear the structure per ordinance." Bill's pulse thundered in his ears. He felt a hand on his shoulder. His neighbor, Don Keller, had come running over from his own porch, still in his bathrobe. "Bill, you want me to call Sheriff Duffy?" Don asked, voice shaking. The man in the windbreaker lifted a sheet of paper as if it were some divine decree. "This is legal. You're trespassing on what is now Redwood Horizon property. The barn is scheduled for demolition." "They can't do this," Don whispered. Bill didn't answer. His chest was too tight to speak. He watched in silence as the first bulldozer rolled forward, its blade gleaming in the half-light. The barn doors shuddered as the machine struck, tearing into the siding. The old beams groaned and splintered like dry bones. He had no words for the sound it made when the roof collapsed. By noon, all that remained was a heap of shattered lumber and the bent pole where the American flag used to hang. The crew packed up, leaving deep tire ruts across the pasture and the reek of diesel in their wake. Don stood beside him, hands jammed into his robe pockets. "Bill," he said quietly, "I know the county clerk. I can." "No," Bill rasped, his voice raw. "Number, I'll handle it." And that was how, in the space of a morning, 70 years of work and memory disappeared. But that night, long after the last machine had gone, Bill sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the crumpled demolition notice. The old anger he'd thought was buried with his Army medals flickered back to life in his chest. They called it progress. He called it war, and he hadn't lost one yet. The next morning dawned clear and cold. A brittle frost sparkled on the ruins of the barn, making the splintered beams look almost beautiful, like the bones of some ancient creature picked clean by time. Bill stood at the edge of the wreckage, hands in the pockets of his canvas coat, breathing in the sharp air. His neighbor Don had tried to convince him to come over for breakfast, but Bill had refused. He needed to see it. He needed to let it sink in that this was real. When he finally turned toward the house, he saw a line of cars coming down the gravel drive. Not the dusty pickups he'd expect from neighbors. These were black SUVs, shiny, official-looking, moving in tight formation like a convoy. For one awful moment he thought Redwood Horizon was back with more threats, or maybe a court order to seize the rest of the property. He braced himself as the vehicle stopped near the fence. The first door swung open, and a tall woman in a dark suit stepped out, squinting against the sun. "Mr. Hargrave," she called. Her voice was steady but not unkind. He nodded, wary. "That's me." She walked toward him, offering a leather badge case. "I'm Special Agent Lorraine Marks, Department of Justice. These gentlemen are with the Office of the Inspector General." She gestured to the other agents climbing out behind her. Bill frowned. "Department of Justice? For what?" Agent Marks's gaze shifted over his shoulder to the pile of splintered wood. "Sir, we received credible reports that Redwood Horizon has been using fraudulent documents to obtain property rights in several counties, including this one." Bill stared at her, the words not quite connecting. "Fraudulent documents?" She nodded gravely. "Evidence suggests they've bribed or threatened local officials to fast-track development permits and seize land through falsified easements. This is part of a larger federal investigation." A low sound rose in Bill's throat, halfway between a laugh and a sob. "So they didn't even have the right—" "We believe the paperwork they presented to you was illegal," she confirmed. "I'm very sorry you had to experience this." Don came jogging across the yard, his boots crunching in the frost. "Bill, what's going on?" Bill didn't answer him. He couldn't. His knees felt weak. For months, he'd thought maybe he was the stubborn fool who wouldn't accept that times were changing, that maybe he was clinging to something that didn't belong to him anymore. But now it turned out he'd been right to fight. Agent Marks continued, her tone crisp. "We'll need you to provide any documents you received from Redwood Horizon. Letters, contracts, notices. We'll also be coordinating with the State Attorney General's office. In the meantime, you have the legal right to remain on this property. No further action can be taken without a federal court order." Bill swallowed hard. "What about my barn?" "I'm afraid restitution will be part of a civil process," she said gently. "But Redwood Horizon may be subject to significant penalties, including damages." He turned back to the ruin, his heart twisting. Money wouldn't bring it back. But maybe, just maybe, it could build something in its place. By late morning, the SUVs were gone, leaving behind a business card and the promise that he wasn't alone in this. Bill sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the folder of documents Agent Marks had asked him to collect. His hands trembled as he turned over the forged signatures and official seals. "Bill?" He looked up to see Don standing in the doorway. "You okay?" Bill exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to burn every scrap of pauper and pretend none of this happened." Don nodded, then looked down at his own boots. "I heard the agent say this might help everyone else, too. You do this, you're standing up for all of us." A memory rose unbidden. His father's voice on the day he signed for the land. "This place is yours to keep safe." Bill closed the folder and squared his shoulders. "They picked the wrong old man," he said quietly. Don smiled. That's the Bill Hargrave I know. Outside, the wind stirred the ash-gray remains of the barn. It whispered through the grass and over the broken beams, carrying a promise that this wasn't over. And for the first time since the bulldozers came, Bill felt something like hope. Bill didn't sleep much that night. He sat in his worn recliner, the folder of evidence on the side table, and listened to the wind creak the porch boards. Now and again, he'd close his eyes and see the bulldozer's blade tearing through the siding, hear the splintering wood, feel the heat of shame burning behind his ribs. But dawn came, and with it a clarity he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. He brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and called the number Agent Marks had given him. A young man with a calm voice answered and promised they'd be back by noon to collect official statements and take photographs. After he hung up, Bill stood in the kitchen and looked around. The place was as familiar to him as his own skin. The knot in the pine paneling where he'd once patched a hole, the dent in the fridge door where his late wife, Margaret, had backed into it with the laundry basket. He laid a hand on the countertop, feeling the worn laminate under his palm. He'd spent most of his life here, raising 3 sons who'd all left for cities, watching Margaret slip away from cancer, fighting droughts and floods and debt. And in all those years, he'd never once asked for help. But he understood now that pride could become a cage. And if Redwood Horizon had stolen from him, they'd likely stolen from other families too. When the SUVs returned, Bill was waiting on the porch with a cardboard box of every paper he'd ever received from the developers. Agent Marks climbed out, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Hargrave," she greeted, "I appreciate your cooperation." He nodded and passed her the box. "If these bastards think they can come into my town and push me off my own land, they picked the wrong farmer." Her mouth twitched in something that might have been the start of a smile. "I believe you." 2 agents fanned out to photograph the property while Mark sat with Bill at the kitchen table. She recorded his statement, occasionally asking gentle questions. When he described the demolition, how the machine had smashed the barn door, how the roof gave way, his voice cracked. He pressed his knuckles to his mouth. He hated that he couldn't keep it together, but Marks didn't rush him. She waited, patient and steady, until he found the words again. When they were done, she closed her notebook. "I'd also like you to speak with an attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office," she said. "We're building a case that could result in criminal charges. Your testimony will be crucial." Bill looked past her to the window, where the field stretched out in frost-bitten rows. He thought of all the men who'd walked this land before him, all the sweat and sacrifice that had gone into each acre. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Neighbors came by, one after another. Don and his wife, the Hendersons from down the road, even young Caleb Jenkins, who worked at the feed store. They brought pies, casseroles, hot coffee, and thermoses. "I heard what happened," Caleb said, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrave. My dad says Redwood Horizon tried the same thing with his cousin out near Cedar Bluff." Bill studied the young man's earnest face. "Tell your dad to save every scrap of paper they ever sent. This isn't over." Caleb nodded solemnly. Late in the afternoon, when the agents were finally gone, Bill stood in the yard beside Don. The 2 men watched the last SUV disappear down the drive. "You really think they'll pay for this?" Don asked. Bill felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. One way or another. The winter sun was sinking behind the trees, turning the sky the color of old copper. The wreckage of the barn cast long shadows across the pasture. Bill let the cold wind lift the hair off his forehead, thinking about what Agent Marks had said, about justice, about holding people accountable. He didn't know how long it would take or how much it would cost. But he knew this. He was not going to die quietly so some developer could make a profit off his family's land. And in that moment, with frost crunching under his boots and the scent of wood smoke drifting from Don's chimney, Bill Hargrave felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Purpose. The days that followed were a flurry of phone calls, paperwork, and cautious hope. Bill spent hours with Agent Marks on conference calls, reviewing every document Redwood Horizon had sent. She connected him with a lawyer in Topeka, Stephen Galbraith, a steady-voiced man who specialized in property fraud cases. Stephen's office sent over forms for Bill to sign, affidavits and authorizations, the kind of paperwork that seemed endless but necessary. At night, when the wind rattled the windows, Bill sometimes lay awake thinking of Margaret. She'd always been the practical one, the one who believed in the system. If you're in the right, the truth will win out, she used to say. He clung to that now, like a lifeline. One morning, about a week after the agents had come, Bill's phone rang before dawn. He squinted at the caller ID, Stephen Galbraith. "Morning, Mr. Hargrave," Stephen began, sounding surprisingly upbeat for 6 o'clock. "I wanted you to know Redwood Horizon's legal counsel reached out to us late yesterday. They've been informed of the federal investigation. They're, let's say, suddenly more cooperative." Bill frowned. "What does that mean?" "They're offering an immediate settlement to avoid escalation. Significant damages for the demolition, plus compensation for emotional distress. They've even suggested rebuilding the barn at their expense." Bill pressed the phone harder to his ear, as though he might hear Margaret's voice telling him what to do. Part of him wanted to accept. Lord knew it would make life simpler. But another part of him, the part that had spent decades on this farm, felt a deeper obligation. "Stephen," he said quietly, "do you think they'd be offering this if we didn't have the DOJ breathing down their necks?" "I doubt it," Stephen admitted, "but it's your choice. If you decline, the investigation continues and your case strengthens." Bill closed his eyes. He thought of the neighbors who'd come by with casseroles, of Caleb's father out in Cedar Bluff, of all the people who didn't have the means or the stubbornness to stand up. "I'm not taking their hush money," he said finally. "If they want to make this right, they can start by telling the truth in front of a judge." "I'll relay that," Stephen replied. And for the first time in their brief acquaintance, Bill heard real admiration in his voice. "I think you're doing the right thing." That day, Bill walked the perimeter of the property. The frost had finally melted, leaving behind damp soil and the first green shoots of spring grass. He paused at the remains of the barn, brushing his fingers over a splintered beam. It had stood through blizzards and tornadoes and droughts, and even broken, it was part of this land's story. He was still standing, too. Around noon, Don came by carrying a thermos of coffee. He joined Bill by the ruined barn, glancing at the pile of boards. "Any news?" he asked. Bill nodded. "They offered a settlement. I turned it down." Don let out a low whistle. "You're braver than I am." Bill smiled faintly. "Maybe just too damn stubborn." They stood in companionable silence, watching the wind move over the pasture. Finally, Don spoke again. "You know, my grandfather lost his land in the 50s. Oil company claimed he didn't pay some fee. He didn't have the fight in him to contest it. Spent the rest of his life regretting it." Bill's throat tightened. He thought of all the stories in this county, families pushed aside by corporations, history paved over and forgotten. "That won't be me," he said quietly, "not if I can help it." Don nodded and clasped his shoulder. "If you need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." Thank you." After Dawn left, Bill went inside to call Agent Marks. Her voice, steady and precise, always calmed him. She explained the next steps: depositions, hearings, the slow machinery of accountability. It was going to take time. Maybe longer than he had left in this world. But the thought didn't scare him the way it once did. He'd learned something in the past few weeks. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every farmer who'd ever been told his land was worth less than a developer's ambition. As he hung up the phone, he felt the last trace of shame drain away. What Redwood Horizon had done wasn't his failure. It was theirs. And he'd see to it the world knew it. Word spread quickly through the county that Bill Hargrave was taking on Redwood Horizon, and not just taking them on, but refusing their settlement. By the end of the week, the local paper, the Plainview Herald, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Veteran Farmer Fights Back Against Developers." Bill didn't ask for attention, but it came anyway. Strangers began stopping by the house. Other landowners, young families, even retirees who'd already lost their own acreage. They'd sit at Bill's kitchen table with cups of strong coffee, trading stories about survey stakes mysteriously moving overnight, or letters with impossible deadlines, or town hall meetings where every decision seemed preordained. One afternoon, a woman named Ruth Vaughn arrived, her hair pulled into a tight gray bun, a thick folder under her arm. She introduced herself as the chair of the County Historical Society. "Mr. Hargrave, I've been following your case," she said, settling into the creaky chair opposite him. "I believe your barn, well, what's left of it, was eligible for historic designation." Bill raised an eyebrow. "Was?" Ruth sighed. "Technically, once a structure is demolished, it's harder to make the designation stick. But if we can prove Redwood Horizon acted unlawfully, we might still be able to file an injunction that would halt all development here until the case is resolved." It was the first time Bill felt like the barn's story could be more than rubble and old memories. He leaned forward. "Tell me what you need." That night, Ruth stayed late, poring over old photographs and property records Bill had kept in a dented metal file box. She was meticulous, noting dates and signatures, comparing them to the documents Redwood Horizon had filed. "I've seen this before," she murmured. "Developers forge permits, then destroy what's standing to make the theft irreversible." Bill thought of the moment the bulldozer hit the siding. He clenched his jaw, fighting down the anger that still roared in his chest when he remembered it. "You think we have a chance?" he asked. Ruth looked him in the eye. "Yes, but you need to understand. This won't be fast, it won't be easy. They're counting on wearing you down." Bill nodded slowly. "I've outlasted droughts, tornadoes, and cancer. I can outlast them." The following morning, a film crew from a regional news station pulled up the drive. A young reporter with a crisp blazer and nervous smile climbed out, accompanied by a cameraman hefting equipment. "Mr. Hargrave," she called, approaching cautiously. "I'm Anna Morales with Channel 6. We'd like to hear your side of the story." Bill wasn't sure he wanted to be on television, but he also knew Redwood Horizon was spending a fortune to bury this in legal threats and polished press releases. If telling the truth to a camera made it harder for them to hide, he was willing. He led the reporter to the barn site. While the cameraman set up, Anna asked if he'd mind sharing how it felt to stand here now. Bill took off his cap, pressing it to his chest. "Feels like losing a part of yourself. Like they came in the night and stole something that can't be replaced." He paused, fighting for control of his voice. The cold wind pulled at the corners of the blue tarp covering the debris. "But I'm still here," he said finally, "and I won't go quiet." The segment aired that evening, and Bill's phone rang for hours. Friends, neighbors, strangers from across the state. Some just called to say they were proud of him. Others offered to donate to his legal fees. Late that night, he stood at the window, looking out over the dark fields. The sky was cloudless, stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. He thought of Margaret, her voice soft in his memory. If you're in the right, the truth will win out. He laid his palm against the glass. I'm trying, he whispered. And somehow, despite the ruin and the uncertainty, he felt a fragile hope take root. 2 weeks later, Bill found himself sitting at a long oak table in the county courthouse, facing the same corporate lawyers who'd once tried to buy him off. His hands trembled a little when he signed his affidavit, but his gaze stayed steady. Ruth sat beside him, her folder bristling with annotated documents. Agent Marks and Stephen Galbraith were there too, quiet but unmistakable in their presence, a reminder that this fight was bigger than one farmer and one barn. The hearing wasn't a trial, not yet, just the first step in deciding whether Redwood Horizon's permits would be suspended. But for Bill, it felt like crossing an invisible line. No more threats behind closed doors. No more polite letters. Everything out in the open. When the county commissioner asked if he had any statement to make, Bill rose slowly, feeling every one of his 68 years. He looked out across the rows of chairs. Neighbors filled them. Don, Caleb, and his father. Folks Bill hadn't seen in years. People who'd known his parents, who'd watched his boys grow up, who understood that this fight was about more than lumber and dirt. Before you make any decisions, Bill began, voice hoarse, I want you to think about what it means when a man can spend 40 years working the same ground, paying his taxes, raising his children, and then wake up to bulldozers in his yard. He laid a hand on the table, feeling the smooth varnish under his palm. I served this country because I believed we were better than that. Because I thought if you worked hard and kept your word, you were safe. The room was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers. I'm not the only one this has happened to. Maybe I'm just the first one who wouldn't back down. He met the commissioner's gaze squarely. I'm asking you to make it right. Not just for me, for all of us. When he sat back down, Ruth squeezed his hand. For a moment, he let himself feel how tired he was, tired of fighting, tired of remembering the day the barn fell. But beneath the weariness, something steady kept him upright. It was late afternoon when the hearing adjourned. The commissioner announced that the county would issue an immediate injunction halting all Redwood Horizon activity pending further investigation. A low rustle of relief and surprise moved through the crowd. Bill let out the breath he'd been holding so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. Outside, the sun was bright on the courthouse steps. Don clapped him on the shoulder. You did it, he said, grinning. Bill shook his head. Not yet, but it's a start. Reporters waited at the bottom of the steps, cameras already rolling. Bill felt the old instinct to turn away, but he thought about Margaret's voice in his memory, about the families who'd called to thank him, about the men in black SUVs who'd promised him he wasn't alone. He squared his shoulders and stepped up to the microphones. A reporter called out, Mr. Hargrave, do you think Redwood Horizon will retaliate? Bill looked straight into the lens. I don't care what they do, he said plainly. I've already lost what they thought would break me, and I'm still standing. Later that night, after the courthouse lights went dark and the cameras packed up, Bill walked the perimeter of his land again. The barn was gone, but the land was still here, and so was he. He paused by the place where the barn doors had once swung open on warm mornings. He imagined Margaret standing there with a cup of coffee, waving to him as he came in from the fields. I hope you'd be proud, he murmured. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. More hearings, more paperwork, more of the slow grind of justice. But he knew this much. he was done apologizing for fighting back. As the stars came out over the fields, he felt something he hadn't felt in months, like the world was tilting, just slightly, back into balance. In the weeks that followed, Bill's story spread beyond Kansas. A national newspaper picked it up, running a feature on predatory development practices in rural America. Then, a late-night news program aired a segment called The Farmer Who Wouldn't Move, showing old photographs of the barn and clips of Bill at the courthouse. At first, he didn't watch any of it. It felt too strange, seeing his own face, hearing his voice on television. But when Don brought over a recording, insisting he needed to see how many people were rooting for him, Bill finally agreed. He sat in his recliner, hands folded tight in his lap, as the host introduced the story. The camera panned over the wreckage, the blue tarp flapping in the wind. Then it showed Bill, standing on the courthouse steps in his worn canvas coat, saying, "I've already lost what they thought would break me, and I'm still standing." The host turned back to the camera. For some, this is just about property. For others, it's about dignity. Bill felt a hot pressure behind his eyes. He swallowed hard. "I didn't set out to be an example," he said quietly. Don nodded. "You didn't have to. You just told the truth." Calls and letters poured in after that broadcast. A Veterans Association from Missouri wrote to say they stood behind him. A retired judge from Oklahoma sent a note praising his courage. But it wasn't the attention that mattered most. It was the sense that, for the first time in a long time, people were really seeing what was happening in places like Plainview. One morning, Stephen Galbraith called with news. "Bill," he said, sounding almost giddy, "Redwood Horizon's senior management has been subpoenaed. Federal investigators found evidence of widespread document tampering and bribery across multiple counties." Bill closed his eyes, gripping the receiver. So they're finally going to face consequences. It looks that way. And the Department of Justice is considering a broader action, possibly even seizing assets if they don't comply. Bill let out a slow breath. For months, he'd lived with the fear that Redwood Horizon would bury him in court filings and legal fees until he gave up. Now, it looked like the tide had turned. That afternoon, he drove into town in his old Ford pickup. People stopped him on the sidewalk outside the hardware store, shaking his hand, clapping him on the back. "We're proud of you, Bill," Mrs. Henderson said, tears shining in her eyes. "You did what none of us thought possible." He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded, feeling the warmth in his chest. Later, as he drove back down the gravel road to his farm, he thought about all the nights he'd sat awake, wondering if he was a fool to resist. But here he was, driving home to the same fields he'd walked as a boy, still here, still fighting. That evening, Agent Marks called to check in. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she said. "The Department of Justice will be issuing a formal statement tomorrow. They'll announce charges against Redwood Horizon's executives." Bill leaned against the kitchen counter. "You've done more than I ever thought possible." Her voice softened. "You're the one who made this happen. You kept the records. You told your story." After he hung up, he stepped out onto the porch. The sky was purple and gold over the fields. In the hush of twilight, he felt Margaret's absence more keenly than ever, but also her presence, in a way that made his heart ache and heal all at once. He thought of her favorite saying, the one she'd whispered when times were hard. "One day, all this will matter to someone else." It was true. It mattered now. He stood there until the stars came out, breathing in the cold, clean air. And for the first time since the bulldozers came, he let himself believe that something good could grow from what had been taken. The morning the charges were announced, Bill woke before dawn. He brewed coffee, strong and dark, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the radio crackle with early news reports. Federal prosecutors today filed criminal charges against Redwood Horizon Developments, citing a pattern of fraud, bribery, and illegal land seizures across 3 states. He closed his eyes. He should have felt triumphant, he supposed, but mostly he felt tired in a way that settled deep in his bones. Still, under the weariness, there was a quiet satisfaction. He'd done what he could. Just after sunrise, Don came by, rapping on the screen door. He held up a newspaper with a front-page headline that made Bill's chest tighten. "You see this?" Don said, grinning. "You did it." Bill studied the bold letters, the picture of him standing in front of the ruins. He shook his head slowly. "I didn't do it alone." Don patted his shoulder. "Maybe not, but you started it." Later that morning, Agent Marks called one last time. "Mr. Hargrave," she said, her voice warm, "I wanted you to know Redwood Horizon has agreed to a full settlement. They'll pay damages, legal fees, and fund the reconstruction of your barn." Bill pressed his hand over his heart. "They're really going to rebuild it?" "Yes," she confirmed. "And the county has agreed to designate your property as a historic site. No further development can be approved without your consent." He swallowed hard. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the barn standing again, its beams clean and new, the doors wide open to the morning sun. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "You don't have to," she replied. "You just had to tell the truth." The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Crews arrived to clear the debris. Architects met with Bill at his kitchen table, sketching out plans that honored the old barn's shape while updating it to modern standards. Neighbors stopped by to watch the progress. Some brought pie or coffee. Others just stood beside him in the yard, quietly acknowledging what it meant to see something destroyed being made whole again. One afternoon, a young woman with a notepad approached him by the construction site. "Mr. Hargrave?" she asked. "I'm writing a book about land rights cases. I'd like to include your story if you'll allow it." Bill hesitated. He'd never thought of himself as anyone worth writing about. But he thought of Margaret, and how she'd always believed that ordinary people could change things just by standing up. "All right," he said finally. "If it helps someone else, you can tell it." When the barn was finished, they held a small gathering to mark the occasion. The sun was bright that day, the air warm with early summer. Bill stood in the open doorway, breathing in the scent of new lumber and fresh paint. He ran a hand over the smooth frame, feeling the sturdy grain under his palm. The old American flag that had once hung inside was gone, but Don surprised him with the replacement, carefully folded, just as it had been when Bill brought it home from his last deployment. With hands that trembled only slightly, he climbed the ladder and tacked it high on the rafters. When he climbed back down, he turned to find Don, Ruth, Caleb, and a dozen neighbors standing together. Don stepped forward, his voice thick. "You reminded us what it means to belong to a place, to fight for it." Bill swallowed the lump in his throat. "I didn't set out to be an example," he said, voice rough. "I just didn't know how to do anything but stand my ground." People nodded. Some wiped their eyes. As the gathering broke up, Bill lingered alone inside the barn. Light poured in through the high windows, warming the smooth floor. He thought of Margaret again, her laughter, her quiet faith in him. One day, all this will matter to someone else. It already did. He closed his eyes and breathed in the peace he'd earned. He didn't know what the future would bring, whether more companies would come knocking, whether more battles would have to be fought. But he knew this. If they did, he'd be ready. Because there were some things worth defending until your last breath. And this land, this story, was one of them. If you were moved by Bill's story, please subscribe to our channel for more true stories of justice, resilience, and ordinary people standing up for what's right. Thank you for watching.